I thought for these next 2 weeks we'd dare to plunge into some of the insights of Bernadette Roberts' works on no self. So this is the experience of no self. Remember, those of you who are following, that she's since passed, but she was, well, as you see, no self, it sounds totally Buddhist, but she approached her experience completely from a Christian point of view. So for us who straddle the two, it's a fascinating thing. Father Thomas Keating, one of the blurbs says, one of the most significant spiritual books of our day. An amazing book. It clarifies the higher regions of the spiritual path. Well, for that reason, I'm not recommending it, but it is tough. But I wanted to share, because some of this stuff, some of what she says illuminates Zen and vice versa, and other paths as well, as we'll see even more next week. So I'm just going to share some of the insights and compare it. Towards the beginning, she says, I noticed that when I visually focused in on a flower, an animal, another person, or any particular object, slowly the particularity would recede into a nebulous oneness, so that the object's distinctness was lost to my mind. It is truly marvelous how this works. It is a unique type of experience. The marvel of it isn't the loss of individuality of the object observed. It's the marvel is that into which it blends and ultimately disappears. And I call that oneness, or God, as she said. This is really what happens, as you go deeper in the experience, is you can focus on something simple, direct, like the oak tree in the garden, as the koan says, or a stone, or anything, a flower. But there's a hugeness there. There's an interconnectedness. There's the absolute. Remember we spoke recently about the various ways that Zen speaks about the absolute is in the relative, and the relative is in the absolute. Well, this is what we're talking about here. So the relative is in the absolute, and that's what you perceive. So that's very distinctive. She was trying to figure out the nature of this seeing. I came upon the notion of our original consciousness, the type of consciousness we all have from the beginning. The infant, she says, doesn't think. There's no content in his consciousness. So all of this then were born without a reflective, self-conscious type of mind, which to me is an apt definition of seeing. So do you remember I quoted the 80th koan in the Blue Cliff record recently, where a monk asked Joshu, does an infant have the sixth consciousness, which is that kind of reflexive consciousness that we're talking about here, in addition to the five senses? The sixth one in Zen, in Buddhism, is that type of reflective consciousness. And Joshu said, it's like throwing a ball on a stream. So in other words, the stream of reality and consciousness, just of awareness, just goes on and on. It's like the ball being tossed. You don't grab onto it, you don't hold onto it, you don't think about it, you don't reflect on it. So in other words, that's pure consciousness. And that's what an infant has. What she's saying, like, can we say that an infant has that? Now she'll go on to say that the hole in this conclusion, that this is very much like what we're talking about, is that the infant's consciousness may actually be relative, even though it's not self-reflecting. In other words, that's part of the answer as well. Well, the structure is there, it just hasn't been activated yet. So it's not exactly the ideal to say we want to go back to an infant consciousness. We want to have a purer type of consciousness that's very much like that before that self-reflection comes in. So she says, in the process of reverting back to our original consciousness, so to speak, We have to learn how to live without any self-consciousness, the buildup of a lifetime, perhaps, which is not an easy adjustment to make, she says, right? Because you've got all this stuff, all these reactions and experiences and reflections and built over that encrust our pure experience, and that kind of self-reflective consciousness is what we have to get beyond self in that sense. She says, but it's exciting to think we can make it at all to do that. Even more exciting to think of what would happen if every person could live as he was originally intended to live. In other words, well, in Buddhist terms, not clinging and not resisting, just like ball on top of the current, just flow, just go with the flow, as they say. So that's interesting. So it's still interesting to speculate what the infant may actually see and know before the mind has become conditioned. But then she's still trying to reflect, well, what is perceiving this oneness? And so she goes on, reflecting in that way. She says, as soon as we reflect on our experiences, we invest value and meaning and purpose in them, some kind of reflection on it. She says, I was losing the pearl of great price, well, a good image, a pearl of great price by giving them a premature closure. You're assigning even a positive value. You're assigning a value, but then you're closing it. You're closing it in, and defining it in a way that's limiting. So it was only by investing no value in an experience that I was able to find out its truth, its falsity, its reality. So long as our experiences come and go, we're investing them with our own values and thoughts and emotions, and we'll never find out what the truth of them are. What remains when there are no experiences left. The truth, she says, is what remains when there are no experiences left. Experiences in the sense of, I am appropriating this flow, and it becomes my experience, and that becomes a limitation and a definition of yourself, which can then become yourself, and the self, we're trying to get to the no self. That's interesting. In some of her questions and comments, she sent some of her reflections out to her friends, and none of them understood it, of course. But then her reaction to some of what they said. Then she said, what about the pure experience of oneness without going through sense objects, like the absolute in itself, according to the five things, the five types of Zen experience? See it directly and immediately, without going through the medium of sensory objects. In other words, as long as we see God, or the oneness through the created world, we are still on a relative plane. I am seeing this, so that's still got that duality of consciousness there. Once you go beyond, a passageway, of insight or experience, there was no seeing of either oneness or multiplicity. You don't distinguish the one and the many anymore. That's why when you see the oak tree in the garden, you immediately have also the absolute, but it's just the experience. You don't put definitions one or many or absolute and relative on it. As soon as you do, you're getting in the way. Your mind is getting in the way. And of course, you are one, whoever you are one with that. It's not you standing back here looking at that experience. That's the whole point. There's only the seeing of what is. That's her ultimate view. Not a view, because it's not hers. There's only the seeing of what is. And the seeing itself of what is, you can call it God if you want, but that's what we are seeing. We are the seeing, which is beyond the relative plane, and therefore beyond the one and the many. Thus, on a strictly non-relative plane, she concludes, what is is the I, capital E-Y-E, not the I, ego, E-Y-E, capital E, seeing itself. Of course, it's not actually an I, it's not Sauron, it's just the I, seeing itself, and wherever it looks, it sees only itself, and nothing else, she says. So there's just pure seeing, pure consciousness, and bliss, or whatever, as the Hindus say, So that's. But I want to share this too. Her next little paragraph is about, another reaction. She doesn't want to see the world as illusion, the way the Hindus call it Maya. Relatively speaking, it is, but relatively. That's the whole point. It's not that form, is illusion. It's relative. It doesn't have any substance in itself. We're all connected. It's all one reality. It's all emptiness in the end. But it's not an illusion in the sense that we usually mean it. And I think that's an important point to make. And I don't think that's really what is meant in Hinduism either. It's just a way of speaking about it. So I see the world and its content as utterly real, even though it has no individual existence of its own, but everything is totally dependent on the one great reality, the one existent, all in capitals. At the same time, and this is where the illusion comes in, I recognize that all form is fragile, subject to change. Nothing is permanent, right? That it may easily come and go and dissolve into the oneness from which it came. But, as we will too, but none of it is an illusion. Nevertheless, I think I know where the notion of world as illusion came from. You can see. But her conclusion line is very good. It's humorous. There are numbers, quite a few times I laugh out loud, when I'm reading this. But she was a wife and mother. She had 4 kids. So none of this nonsense about, I have to go up on a mountaintop or into a monastery in order to become a contemplative. No, better you don't. You'll more likely become a contemplative. So, I will be gone, dissolved, as all form will into eternal form, or what is. In the meantime, I cannot regard the continual coming and going of my children as the interruptions of mere illusion. Though I admit it would be helpful at times if this were true. So, she's pretty good, right? Very down to earth in that best possible way. So what this seeing is, it's also pure doing. She spends a number of times, she brings up this point very well. It's pure act. The same way Thomas Aquinas speaks about the absolute, about God being pure act, that it's dynamic, it's energized, it's energy. It's pure doing in the sense that there's no self deciding by will, either absolute or relative, no self deciding to do something and intervene. It's just pure doing. It's what the Taoists mean by Wu Wei. Not doing is doing, because there's no intervention, there's no reflection about it. It's just pure doing. It's also what the Meditations on the Taro, the very first one, speaking about the magician, that it's effortless concentration, effortless action, because it's pure action. There's no intervention or qualification or limitation by a self deciding to do some action or not. It's just pure act. And that comes through quite a bit. She mentions the affective system of the self, with its, this is what the Buddha is always talking about, and also the other spiritual traditions about passions, resisting or clinging or wanting, or when that gets out of the way, and even the will gets out of the way, as she explains later too, we fear that life would be nothing without it, she says. We are afraid that without feelings we'll be inhuman, cold, insensitive, robot-like creatures so detached from this world that we might as well be dead. Which is the way a lot of, quote, spiritual people became. Needless to say, there's no truth to this view. It's just another myth created out of fear of the unknown, where all myths come from. Well, I don't think I'd put it that way, but you see what she's saying. Nevertheless, to explain what life is like without this system, this affective system, this self, is basically impossible. It's a dimension that can only be lived, it can't be understood. But this next statement is really, really good. All that need be said is that it is a dynamic, intense state of taking care of whatever arises in the now moment. Totally Zen, you know. Just the now, the eternal now, what Eckhart Tolle speaks of, the now, the power of now. It's so alive. It's dynamic, intense state of taking care of whatever arises in the now moment. But you're not doing it. It's just the act, spontaneously taking care of whatever arises. And it's so intense and so dynamic and so pure because there's no intervention of the self. But that's what life is like. That pure now all the time of doing exactly what the situation demands. So many modern Zen teachers point that out, that that's really the goal of what we should be experiencing and looking for. Although we can't be looking for it because then it's the self. But anyway. So this is what I call doing. She also usually puts it in quotes. Doing, quotes, and this is what she's talking about. Which is the ability to act in the absence of any interior experience of will or energy. Your will's not intervening, and you're not making any exertion or effort to do it. It's just happening. Such a non-relative dimension is so difficult to understand. It raises all sorts of psychological, philosophical, theological questions. It's beyond logic. But that's what it feels. She has a better, more detailed presentation of it. Let's see. Where that's why the pure act comes in. To act without a doer is to do so unconsciously, in the good sense, because it is your very nature to act and you cannot do otherwise. It's just pure life, pure existence. Where self had been the will or energy formerly experienced, the doer, in other words, but there's no doer, there's just doing. Here there is no self to get into the act, no self to buck it up. But without self or a doer, act or doing goes right on because it's identical with existence. Pure act, again, God's existence is God's action, But ours too, when we truly are who we are. Another way to understand doing is that it takes the place of the will. So all the stuff about, our will, power, and we have to exert our will and make choice, get over it. Get over it. You'll be a lot happier. You won't be, but you'll be happiness itself, Since the will is self, that's absolutely true. The seat of all experiential energies, now that it's gone, how is it possible to live without a will, you might ask? The answer is that doing takes its place. Doing goes on even without a will. Pretty fascinating stuff. And let me just offer this. So at one point in this journey, self goes forth, contributes what it can give, and then fades forever beyond reach. Self then is part of this movement, a part through which all people must pass. So she makes the point, you have to have a self first before you can give it up. You have to have a self to reach beyond the self. And the only aspect of the movement for which we're alone responsible. But just as everything must change, the self too eventually disintegrates and dissolves into nothingness. The only thing we know that never changes or passes away is the movement itself, the doing, the act. As I see it, and this is the last thing she says before the conclusion of the book, a contemplative is one who is aware of this movement. Who becomes it, in other words? Who is conscious? Who is it? At first, he strives to go with it, become one with it. But later, discovering he is being moved without effort, he or she abandons himself to become part of it, one with it, until finally he realizes he has never been anything other than this movement itself. That's what we are. So, just as a little footnote for fun, because this goes, so far, it goes all the way. Before, when she was talking about perceiving the one through the many, this can be, before you get to this stage, you can have this type of experience, which she speaks of here, and I'll just speak about it briefly. All that was left was just this seeing, and yet even this did not really belong to me. It was not localized anywhere in my mental or physical makeup, but instead, now get this, seemed to be on top or a little above my head, toward the front or over the forehead. So at some point in your spiritual experience, you might have that experience precisely, on the way towards, what we've been talking about up to now. And that in my own esoteric tradition with Master Choa, just above the head would be the 12th chakra, the incarnate soul. So coming down into, the crown from above. So you can feel it localized there, become aware of that energy center as you move forward and move along. But also this thing about being in the forehead, toward the front and over the forehead. Master Choa speaks about that as the fifth level of arhatic experience, which is above not the usual ajna chakra, the usual third eye, but he says the real third eye, the higher clairvoyance, is the forehead chakra up here. And you can actually experience this. And what it corresponds to is the unicorn. That's where we get the unicorn. That's where the unicorn symbolizes. Or even the horn in general, but especially the unicorn, often associated with feminine energy, as it is in this particular tradition. So you can experience this kind of luminous energy emanating from or leading to that particular spot in your head. But don't cling to any of this. Just let it shoot out and move forward. But I was very intrigued that she pointed that out or noticed that, because that comes through in other esoteric teachings as well. So you can, have all sorts of experiences along the way, but make sure that you're not your experiences, because you've got to let them go and don't comment on them and ultimately disappear and just be the movement, the light, the doing itself.